Hello, my name is Eduardo, and with my team made by Carla, Christopher, Abraham, Hanedy, and I, we're going to explain the Asian and the Middle East regions of this macroeconomics activity. It's widely assumed that a high GDP leads to high standards of living, and high respect for human rights. However, this sometimes seems far from the truth. But firstly, let's define GDP. GDP is the total market value of the final production of goods and services within a country's territory. It considers both national and foreign companies as long as it's in a country's territories. Um, Countries vary their economic growth of their GDP, but most countries seem to have egg growth. Doesn't matter if it's small, but it's egg growth. So one would assume that people are getting richer and their lives are getting better. Nonetheless, the growth in a country's economy does not mean that people are getting richer, because resources sometimes are not distributed equally, which is why we have other measuring factors for standards of living, such as the Human Development Index. According to the UNDP, the Human Development Index was created to emphasize that people and their capabilities should be the ultimate criteria for assessing the development of a country, not economic growth alone. So it does not take into consideration only the GDP, it takes other factors. The HDI takes factors such as a long and healthy life, being knowledgeable, and have a decent standard of living, which now has a broader spectrum of how people live in a certain country. So this raises the question, do high GDPs automatically translate to high standards of living?
Asia is the biggest continent in territory and population, so it is not a surprise that there are big contrasts between countries who have very low inflation rate like Japan, a very low percentage of unemployment like Thailand, and their GDP per capita is very high like Singapore's. But in the other hand, there are countries like Syria with a GDP per capita of $2,900 and its inflation rate is of 47%. There are countries that are not developed like Syria, which unemployment rate is of 50%, and besides Syria, geographically, there is Israel, a country whose inflation rate is of minus 0.5% and an unemployment rate of 5%. This means that in one side of the border, the inflation rate is 10 times bigger than the other. So it is not just a regional problem, because if it was, all Arab countries would be in the same situation of Syria or Israel's.
We're going to talk about the country with the lowest GDP per capita in Asia, which is Afghanistan. As you may know, Afghanistan has been experiencing a lot of conflict, and this comes since the invasion from the USSR. So it's quite a long time ago. There are no figures before 2002 because of said conflict, but this doesn't mean that this conflict has stopped. It just has its intensity has just lowered. Okay, so for 2016, its ranking in GDP per capita is in 168 with $1,900. This is not far from the Human Development Index adjusted to inequality, which is 169. Which means they are kind of the same, the money that people have and the way they are living. However, there is a bigger difference between the GDP ranking and the GDP per capita ranking. It's a difference of minus 65. This means that the country has more money than the overall population. Also, what happens with the IHD ranking is that the difference is bigger. So we can see that the fact that a country has money or has a growing economy doesn't mean that their quality of living of the citizens is great. Also, as you can see in the graph, there are many years that have an NA. This means that the information was we couldn't find it even because before 2002. It's because of this conflict mentioned earlier, and after it's because it's quite difficult to find the information from reliable sources after before 2009, especially with the UN Human Development reports.
This graph shows Qatar's GDP. Qatar is number 6 in GDP ranking and number 1 in GDP per capita ranking. This because Qatar is a very small country. Qatar doesn't have an HDI inequality adjusted ranking, but the HDI normal ranking is 33. This HID ranking means that life in Qatar is not as bad as other parts in Asia and Middle East. It is actually good for an average person.
We can assume that the difference between Afghanistan, that has the lowest GDP per capita and the biggest unemployment rate in Asia, is huge compared to Qatar, that has the biggest GDP per capita and the lowest unemployment rate in Asia. This shows how big is the difference between two countries even if they are in the same continent.